Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to touch on different checkmate patterns and how it's important to primarily focus on getting to know different patterns and how to apply them in different situations. So that's exactly what we will do in this lesson. We'll take 3 different patterns and see a number of specific examples on how the same idea can be implemented from actually different positions. Let's get started. Okay, this is our first example, and it is White's turn. Well, hopefully you can figure out what White should do right now. One thing I'd like to point out that despite the fact that we are in an endgame, White is on an attack, and White in fact can and should checkmate on this next move. And that move is, hopefully you know the answer already before I will show it, simply moving the rook up to c8, and it's game over. It's game over because of the back rank weakness. The king cannot move up as there is no 9th rank, and the other way, the white knight doesn't let it out to g7, and the other 2 pawns on f7 and h7 block their way in the side directions. So now that we understand the pattern, let's try to build on it. Okay, here is our second position, which is rather similar, and hopefully it's an easy hint to the solution. What are we trying to do? We should try to use our creativity and imagination and see, based on the pattern we just learned in the first position, how can we get there? In chess, it's rather important to try to know where you're going. In fact, that's the only way to get there. Just like in life, you have to know what your goal is in order to get there. Otherwise, it may just happen accidentally, but that's not something to count on or rely on. So in this case, what we'd like to see a couple things. On one hand, to force that black king back to the edge of the board, to the back rank. And second of all, we would want to have our knight on f5, where it will control the g7 square. And voila, here is the solution. White indeed can accomplish that in one move by giving a check with the knight on f5. Now, the black king has no choice but moving down to the 8th rank. And it doesn't make a difference in which one of those 3 squares the black king chooses. If the king goes to f8, doesn't help either, because nevertheless the rook comes up and the knight controls the e7 square as well. So that's kind of an important point, that the black king has no way out. Let's follow up and see a different set of pieces on the board. And here is the next position where White, instead of having a knight, has a bishop. And now the challenge is exactly the same. So that's what I mean by pattern recognition. The important pattern is that we do have a rook that's ready to go down to the back rank, to the 8th rank. So the only challenge is to make sure that we can force that black king down there to the 8th rank and control the g7 square. So that's the pattern that we're trying to work. And even though we don't have a knight, the idea is going to be identical. So in this case, the correct move is, again, making a forceful move by checking black's king. And now the black king has only 2 choices, but regardless where it goes, even if it goes to f8, the bishop, just like the knight from f5, also controls not just g7, but also the e7 square. So therefore, when the rook arrives, the checkmate pattern is again the same. Let's move on when we will not have neither a knight nor a bishop, but nevertheless will succeed with the same pattern. In this position, we have a pawn. However, the pawn in this case is just as valuable as the bishop was. It will accomplish exactly the same. By advancing the pawn, we push the black king down to the 8th rank, and again the pawn is controlling the two key squares on e7 and g7. The rook is ready to come down, announcing checkmate. Let's see now a slightly more complex situation where white needs to combine several different elements. It wasn't just that quite simple of check, moves, and checkmate. What's going on right here? The black bishop on e5, remember black now has a bishop as well, so actually it is black who is up a pawn in this position. And that bishop is attacking the white rook and the white knight at the same time. And contrary to the last example, the bishop is also controlling that f6 square. So therefore, it would be a serious mistake for white now to advance the pawn, because black would have an option. The king will not be forced to move. In fact, black shouldn't move. Black should capture the pawn, and quite importantly, this is a check. So now white does not have the time to move the knight to f5 like we saw in the first examples, but the white king must move, and then what will happen is black will capture the white knight before it would ever arrive on f5. So let's go back to the beginning and see what else we may do. The other part that's important to notice in this position is that white has the rook on the 7th rank and not on the 1st rank like we saw in the previous examples. The reason why that's important is because while it can still go to c8 when needed, the pawn on f7 right now is pinned, which means it cannot move. As we know, you can never ever leave your king under attack in check. So therefore, any move that would leave your king in check is illegal. And therefore, in this case, the pawn on f7 is pinned. And because of that, the white knight right now is able to move to e6 without black being able to capture it. And that means that since a knight check can never be blocked, it can either only captured or moving out of it, black now is left with that one choice of moving the king out of the check. And when it does, we already know the answer. The knight is guarding the g7 square, so we're all good there, and the rook is ready to checkmate with rook to c8. And let's see one final example with this pattern. And here is that last position from this series in this pattern. Well, what's interesting in this case is that it is white's move, but white is in a check. And generally, when one is in check, typically is not thinking about attacking, but just let's see how to get safely out of that check. And this is an exception to that habit. And once in a while, and especially in endgames, the king can be a very important part of an attack. Remember, generally, we're just trying to make sure our king is safe, and the king is not an attacking piece. Therefore, this is an exception. But remember, in endgames, it's not so unusual. So right now, the white king needs to get out of the check. If it would move backwards, let's say to f4, the black king, for example, could move to g7, and black would have nothing to worry whatsoever. In fact, it is white who would worry being 2 pawns down. On the other hand, if white right now finds the correct response by playing king to f6, what happens is, even though it's a quiet move, black is quite helpless against avoiding the threatening checkmate with rook c8. What is common with all the previous examples we saw so far in this lesson is that again, a white piece is controlling the key g7 square, the escape square of the black king, while the two pawns on the side of the king on f7 and h7 also take away the escape options, and the white rook is about to come to c8 and checkmate. Black, of course, can avoid the immediate checkmate, for example, by playing rook c2, when naturally white will not move the rook to c8, which the black rook would capture, but would simply first capture the black rook, and then on the following move would move the rook up to c8 to checkmate. So this would only delay the end by one move. Or, if after king f6, black would try to move the rook to one of the open files to then interpose, that also delays the checkmate just by one move when the rook captures it. And one more thing I'd like to point out, that after king f6, the reason why black cannot open a little window of escape for the king is because the black pawn is on h6. If that pawn wouldn't be there, black would be able to move the other pawn on h7. And if that pawn from h7 could move, that would open a little escape window for the king. But because you cannot capture your own pawn, therefore black is stuck. Also, if black could capture his own pawn, he could capture his own pawn on h6, checking the white king and again saving himself. But yet again, that's not possible. You can never ever capture in chess your own pieces. And now let's switch over to a completely different pattern and let's see ideas in that situation. Here we are. This is another very typical pattern that is very useful and very common. In this situation, the two heroes are the white rook and the bishop. Right now, it's white's turn, and hopefully you can figure out how to end the game quickly and successfully for white. And yes, indeed, that correct move is moving the rook to the corner. Now the bishop is guarding the rook as well as the g7 square. And the black king cannot move up to h6 either because the rook through an x-ray is controlling that square as well. So right now, this is game over for black, as black is in checkmate. Let's see a bit more complex situation on the same theme. Here we go. Well, right now, the white rook is unable to go to h8 at this moment. However, white can force to get to the same position we just saw in the previous example. And again, to achieve such goals, typically, it's ideal to make it through forceful moves. And in this case, the correct answer is to play rook c8 check. The black king has no choice but to move out to h7, and voila, the rook arrived. Black had no choice. White could force his own idea on black. Now let's compare, on the other hand, what would happen if white instead would try to play rook h1 with similar ideas on getting the rook to h8. Well, the big difference is that this is not a forceful move. That is, black is not in check right now. And therefore, black would have the time to simply capture the bishop on d4 and no more checkmate, because if now the rook gets to h8, it will be simply captured as it has no support of the bishop. So as we can see, time is the essence, and to make a forceful move makes a whole big difference. Let's see a slightly different situation when the black king is no longer on g8, but it's on h7. Now the story becomes just reversed than what we saw in the last example. If right now white continues the same way, blindly following the move that we saw in the previous example and play rook c8, that would be a major mistake, because now this move is no longer a check. And therefore, even though white right now is threatening to checkmate on h8, black will have the time to capture that supporting piece, the bishop, and have a winning position. And here, just reversed as in the last position. The correct move is to come from the other side, checking the black king. When the king moves back to g8, the rook still gets to h8, announcing checkmate. A very important pattern that you can try to set up in your own games. Let's see another example where things are a bit more delicate. Here we go. In this position, the bishop is still hanging on d4, and seemingly white cannot give a check. But yet it can. But it's one of those rare situations when you do move a different piece than the one which will end up giving the check. And that's a very special situation called the discovery. And in this case, even more unusually, it is the king that makes that unexpected move. Instead of trying to waste time to get the rook all around and get it to h8, white is moving the king, opening up the h file for the rook, and now we already know the story. The king has no choice, needs to move, can only move to g8, and now white is ready to decide the game by again getting the rook to the corner and checkmate. Let's see yet another situation, and this is why it seems so important to be familiar with patterns and not memorize positions. The following position, as we can see, things are all turned around. It is black who is on the attack and black who has the potential to get to that same checkmate idea. Again, the black bishop on b7 is being attacked. So for example, a simple move like knight to f6 would not accomplish the goal of checkmating or even winning the queen. Even though this is also a discovered check, and black is also attacking the white queen at the same time, white can save himself and in fact win material by capturing that same bishop that has been checking the white king. So black has to be extremely careful on how to continue here. Black needs to think what to do, how to move the knight without losing the bishop. Well, the secret is to try to give a so-called double check. A double check is a very special form of check when two pieces at the same time are attacking the enemy king. And therefore, the double check can never be blocked and neither of the two pieces can ever be captured. So here, black actually has two correct solutions. One is to check with the knight on e3, when now both the bishop and the knight are attacking the king, and I'll show you in a minute the other one. Now the king had to move, and we achieved the goal of checkmate. Very nice. Alternatively, knight f4 accomplishes the same, even though in this case the king can also go to f1, but since the knight is controlling the e2 square, the rook now can just move down, kind of similarly like the very first examples we saw in this lesson. So, very nice example. And again, this was involving a double check. In fact, a special form of it, a double check, as all double checked, of course, are discovered checks as well. And now, let's switch to yet another different theme. Here we are. Well, no rooks in this endgame, but the knight and the bishop can still create a beautiful checkmate pattern. So right now what is happening is the white knight is already guarding some very important squares around the black king, the f8 and the h8 squares, and two of the black pieces are also helping white in that they block the escape of the black king. So in this example, it is white's turn, and the checkmate pattern is to move the bishop to c4 and attack the king. The king has no escape, the check cannot be blocked, and neither can the bishop be captured. So now let's move on with a couple slightly more complex positions, how to get here, how to create checkmate patterns with the bishop and the knight. And let's go to our next position, where white cannot checkmate just as simply in one move. White needs to set it up. And that's what pattern recognition is about, to know what you're looking for, where you'd like to get, and see if there is a way to force your opponent into that pattern, into that trap. So let's see. For example, if white in this position would try to play bishop c4 with the idea to then play knight g6, which is kind of a sister version of the same pattern, that would be too slow because it would allow black to open up air around the king and clear, for example, the g7 square as an escape route. Or alternatively, black could move his knight and clear the h7 square. So therefore, this would be a too slow of an approach. On the other hand, white can play very forcefully by giving a check with the knight. And in fact, what you need to be careful about, which check to pick, because there is a good one and a bad one. The bad one is moving to f7, where after the king g8 move, white didn't really make progress, as now the white bishop is certainly not ready to give the checkmate. So going back again to this position, the only correct solution is to check, forcing the black king to move to g8, and now we're ready with the same checkmate we already saw in the previous example. Okay, let's move on to a slightly more different example, again on the same theme. Here we go. In this situation, the question is how to achieve that cooperation between the bishop and the knight that will result in checkmate. Well, the good news is white is ready to give a doubled discovered check. Moving the knight just to give a discovered check will only fully work if black indeed moves the king, and then white will be ready to checkmate with the knight on g6. The problem is that the opponent may do better, and after the knight f4 check, rather give up the rook than get checkmated, and then the fight is still ahead of us because in this case the king can choose to move to the corner and get checkmated, or rather go to the other direction and put up a fight. So going back to the starting position again, the only correct answer is to give the double check from e7. Now black does not have a choice. Remember, whenever a double check arrives, the king needs to move. It's a very special kind of check. And either direction it moves to, the checkmate has arrived. And our final example in this lesson, here we go. Here again, the point is how to get our knight to g6 so it will end up being a checkmate. Well, luckily, we can give a discovered check, and because black has a bishop on e7, the rook cannot block the check, the king again must move, and then actually white has a pleasant choice to checkmate from g6 or to checkmate from d7. Well, I hope you feel a bit more comfortable about these patterns that we have discussed, and the more patterns that you familiarize yourself with, the better chances you have to checkmate your opponent. Good luck in practicing, and look out for these particular patterns and try to use them in your own game. Good luck with it, and be back next week for some more chess patterns. Bye-bye.